Hey, Matt from Hidden Machine here with another video in our growing series of interviews. We've been interviewing people who work and have been around the games industry, and today we've got a chat that I had late last year with a writer and journalist named Stephen Kent. Stephen worked for many years as a freelance journalist covering video games, and his work culminated in two books, The Ultimate History of Video Games, Volume 1, and Volume 2. And now I've heard some people say, and I've read some reviews online, kind of, saying these aren't necessarily the ultimate history of video games. This is Stephen's perspective on things and his anecdotes, his research, his things he wanted to share, but calling it the ultimate history of video games feels like a bit of a reach. And Stephen would agree with that. Actually, he hates that title, and he's going on the record to say so many times. The book, as Stephen originally published it, was The First Quarter, a 25-year history of video games, which told the roughly first 25 or so years of video game history. But when the book was picked up by a publisher, they wanted a flashier title and something that was a little less ambiguous to them. They thought that maybe the first quarter could have been, the first quarter of a football game or something. But despite having Pac-Man on the cover and the thing clearly being about video games, the publisher didn't want to use the original title. They went with The Ultimate History of Video Games, and the title has stuck. But that doesn't mean that these aren't pretty in-depth books, and I've had a lot of fun reading through these, and I was put in touch with Stephen by Jordan Freeman over at Zoom Platform, which is a great place to get DRM-free games, and the two of us had a chat about game history, game preservation, where games were at 25, 30, 40 years ago, where they're at, now, and where they may go in the near future. We cover a wide range of topics. Stephen has interviewed and spoken with and just been around so many major figures in the video game industry over the last, 3 or 4 decades. He's talked to pretty much everybody that you'd want to, talk to in that field. I mean, I'm sure there's some people missing from the list, but he's really done an amazing amount of interviews and work and journalism in the games industry. So getting his perspective on different topics and games and, video game culture, history, traditions, speculation, it was really fun to pick his brain and kind of see what he thought about different things. Now, I do want to mention a few things. At one point in the video, I, on a whim, asked about some rumors I heard about the gaming industry in Brazil. Older systems there had a lot longer lifespan, and there were actually some officially licensed ports of much newer games ported to much older systems. And it was something that I'd heard a little bit about here and there, but I didn't know much about, so I kind of just brought it up. And in my time editing this video, I've gone back and researched that topic a little more heavily, and I want to shout out a video from a channel called Cloth Map that goes really in depth on some of the amazing history of the video game industry in Brazil and how it's kind of like an alternate reality compared to the way things went in the States and other places. Things didn't move at the same pace, and it led to some really incredible games being made, and I don't know, it's just a really wild story. So check that video out. After this one, I'm gonna leave a link down below, or even, if you got to, pause this, go watch that, then come back here, okay? So shout out to Cloth Map, shout out to Zoom Platform and Jordan for hooking up this interview, and thanks to Stephen L. Kent for chatting with me. Let's just get right into our chat, which is already in progress. I noticed that, the games covered are pretty much console games.
Well, it's the ultimate history of video games, not electronic games.
Where would you put things like mobile games and PC gaming? It feels like, from my perspective, so many of these things are becoming so intertwined that it's hard to kind of tell one from another, where, especially in the 90s, early 2000s, there was very different lanes.
Back in 1995 was the first time I went to Nintendo, and I spent the day with Hiroshi Imanishi. And that was at a time when people were talking about convergence, that PCs and televisions were going to converge. Basically, everyone saw it as computers and, computers everywhere. And Hiroshi Imanishi made the statement, which seemed very odd at the time, that he did see convergence in the near future, but he thought the end result would look more like a TV than a computer. And history has proven him correct so far.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things I wanted to ask was, what were some of the early signs of things kind of going the way they have, where it's, when I was growing up playing games, it was common to have a console really be defined by the software available for it. And now there's, a game will be ported to all the major consoles and PC, and there's pretty minute differences a lot of the time between all the different ports. And, there's not as much, to me, it's just as much individuality between each platform as it wasn't, it's not as drastic to me as it was, in the past.
Well, Nintendo, of course, is the big outlier there.
Well, that's very true, and I feel like they have been for a long time.
On a certain level, after that, it's not as big an outlier, but Sony continues to keep itself very in demand by having a much stronger lineup of games than Microsoft has, of exclusive games. For a bevy of reasons, people want to still get a God of War or GTA. I think Forza Motorsport is wonderful, but I think GTA has more of a ring to it. Not GTA, excuse me, Gran Turismo. GTA, of course, has a bigger ring to it than any of them, but it's not very similar to them. And Microsoft is going in the other direction. Now they would like to put Game Pass on PlayStation and everywhere else they can get it.
Yeah, I'm curious from your perspective if there was early iterations of the sort of like online distribution we're seeing right now with games, because I'm seeing every year there's a decline in physical media sales. But what were, some of the early indications that this might be where things were headed, if there were any?
Again, so I remember in probably 94 interviewing Richard Garriot. Richard Garriot in particular, Will Wright to some extent as well, but Richard Garriot really stands out, saying that the age of what he referred to as whirling media was coming to an end. He saw a digital distribution way back then. He had a very clear, has a very clear view, I think, of into the future. I think unquestionably Trip Hawkins saw this coming as well. But he was out of the main realm, off the main stage by the time it happened. 3DO would have been on the forefront of it, though, I think, if it had survived.
That's interesting. I've never even been able to see a 3DO in person. I completely missed that. I remember seeing the game, seeing it in magazines and stuff, but never actually got to touch one.
Well, you didn't miss that much.
Unfortunately, that's the impression that I get from it. Yeah. Do you have any memory of things like, I want to say it was called the X Band, some of the early online play kind of things? Like,
yeah, of course.
Again, I remember reading the previews in Nintendo Power, and it seemed like, to me as a player at the time, it was something that was kind of presented as like, here's this incredible thing that's it's in your living room, it's satellite, and then I don't remember hearing about it ever again after a very brief period. Was that something that was it really just a flash in the pan sort of thing, or?
Oh, absolutely. X-Band was a terrible flash in the pan. The first one that caught a little traction would have, and again, they weren't distributing digitally. You just got to access games digitally, was Dreamcast. The first time I played an online game, a console online game that really meant something was NFL 2K. That was impressive. Now, the first time I played it, I think players have gotten better, but the first time I played it, the guy did the kickoff. I returned it for a touchdown, and he disappeared. And it's hilarious because if he'd gotten a few more downs, he would have seen how lucky I had gotten. But, and then I don't remember a year. It might have been 98 or 99. It could have been a little later. I don't remember the year. I'll preface that. First of all, let me say, I think I'm a pretty good historian. There are people who would disagree with me sharply on that. But I know I'm a horrible, horrible fortune teller. No one will disagree with me on that. I've been wrong on Apple every time. When they came out with iMac, I said, how can you even use a computer that doesn't have a disk drive? And then they came out with iPod, and I said, we just had Nomad and Bandit. MP3 is gone. It's not going. It's dead. Why are you re-releasing it? And then they did iPod, and they did the iPhone. And it's like, wait, where's the buttons? How am I going to use it in the dark? And then it was iPad. And it's like, it's nothing but a big iPod. I was wrong every time. With that preface, here's a really embarrassing story. Gabe Newell invited me over to his offices to sit down and talk with me about this new idea he had called Steam. And I walked away thinking, buddy, stick to games. You'll lose your hat on this one.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, Gabe in particular had such a sharp sight in where he was going and where things were going. And Steam was so ahead of its time when he was explaining it to me. Yeah. Brilliant move on Gabe Newell's part.
Yeah, I mean, the ubiquity of Steam is incredible. It's basically synonymous with PC gaming. I mean, that people don't really even like to use other clients. There's very few competitors out there as it is, but it's a great denominator for PC gaming.
It is. It really is, and yeah. I mean, it used to be you walked into a software, etc., or a Babbage's machine, and you saw walls of PC games and walls of console games. Now, of course, you don't find software, etc., or Babbage's machines around. But if you did, so much of the real estate at GameSpots is used games now.
Right, which I feel like it has a there's got to be an expiration date on that right now, because as there is less and less physical media, it's killing the resale market.
I talk to friends in the console business all the time, and they like to remind me, because I'm kind of sympathetic to GameStop. It's a terrible position to be in, but they like to remind me that just maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 now, GameStop walked through E3 like a Tyrannosaurus Rex through a herd of sheep. And basically legislated, you will this and you will that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a whole lot of sympathy coming towards good old GameStop.
That makes sense. So speaking again, just on this same topic, I remember there being a lot of opposition to digital distribution of music. Mostly because of the, copyright protection and just not having things under control. Piracy's always been an issue in software and even in console gaming to a degree. But I know that a big opposition to going digital was piracy.
Part of the opposition. I mean, well, from the music standpoint, when I was growing up, artists put out an album, maybe an album a year, maybe every few years, but you'd get on the average album, you got 1 or 2 must-have songs, and everything else was utter crap. And thanks to iTunes, now you could pick out that good song, and the utter crap you just walked away from. You didn't have to buy it all.
Right.
And that's a big blow for artists as well.
True.
Not in games, of course. That's a different story. One of the main reasons that Nintendo went cartridges with the N64 was because that was harder to duplicate.
Right. That makes sense. That's what I was curious about. Was there talk about how to kind of circumvent those things going forward? Because it seems like it was something that almost could have happened a bit sooner. But when I first started seeing digital distribution of titles, I remember it being like the Xbox Live Arcade kind of stuff. It was usually smaller budget titles, and the full AAA games didn't really initially didn't seem like they were going full digital yet.
Well, the delivery mechanism wasn't entirely there either. I mean, downloading a full game on an original Xbox or on a dial-up modem on your Dreamcast would have been prohibitively long.
Right. But was the intention, to go full force into there, do you think, or was there hesitation? That's what I'm kind of curious about.
I think it's evolution. I really think it's evolution. If you take a look at the streaming movies on Netflix, when Netflix first started doing streaming, it wasn't Hollywood blockbusters. I think you have the little people, you have the minnows of the industry, and they look at this and they say, okay, this is new, let's see how we do. And then the bigger fish come along and they say, hey, look, those minnows are eating really well, let's go eat them out. And that's how it goes. Nintendo didn't invent the internet until long after Xbox and PlayStation had landed on it.
Right.
Nintendo, of course, a very slow adopter, which goes with their blue water philosophy. But also, like I say, if you got that Dreamcast with that dial-up modem, there were a lot of limitations.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's all evolution. Some of the evolution is an attitude, right? Some of the evolution is, do we risk this on this, or is that going to be a waste of money? Will we be ripped off on if we do that? All kinds of things. And then they come up with new technologies for guarding it, for downloading in reasonable amounts of time. And then things expand.
Speaking on Nintendo definitely has been late to adopt a lot of, trends that I've seen. Like it just, I remember even the GameCube being criticized for the tiny discs, when people wanted the DVD players and everything like that. Nintendo also, not that other consoles haven't done this, but Nintendo's done a lot with unique hardware and games that are impossible to properly emulate because they are so, inextricably tied to the platform that they're on.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, from your experience, was that more common for a time to have more games be kind of tied to this like super specific hardware? Like things like there's like DS games or something, or games that have the gyro ball in them, and you turn the handheld around, like things that you just really can't. I remember seeing a lot in arcades where there's certain games where, if you have a joystick, you could put any board in that machine and it would be fine. But other games, like a silent scope or something requiring very unique hardware.
My favorite, Tempest with its dial.
Oh, that's a great point.
I mean, I love Tempest. And even Tempest with a trackball is not Tempest.
Mm-hmm.
The strange hardware really came later with Nintendo. I mean, yeah, there was a glove that wasn't actually made by Nintendo for the NES.
They had the robot.
They had the robot, but they couldn't come up with very many games for it.
No, I think there was maybe 2 or 3 at most in the US.
And originally it had the pad that you could stomp on for smashing bugs or for doing running games and things.
Yes, the power pad there. I do recall that.
Yeah, looked a little bit like a Twister.
Yeah.
And actually, they had that in arcades for a little while. There was that Bug Stomp game was in arcades.
I wasn't aware of that.
But on the most part, really, I'm trying to think of anything before we were, and DS, where Nintendo hardware was different. I mean, they had the card reader for the Game Boy and the camera for the Game Boy, but those weren't the main system. Those were add-ons.
Yeah, and those are pretty unique experiences.
They were trying to bring life to an aging system.
Right.
And pretty much unsuccessful experiments. I guess in Japan, the camera did pretty well.
It seems like some of those things did do better in Japan. Even the I've seen the Japanese, that there was like a sequel to the Mario Paint series, that was on the disc drive for the N64. We didn't get that at all. I don't think it did well enough to justify coming over here.
And we didn't get the disc drive.
I'm curious about that. Do you have any insight on that? Was that just something that just didn't take off, or?
As I understand it did pretty well in Japan. It's, I haven't looked at that for a long, long time. I still remember going to Akihabara and seeing barrels full of discs for it.
Huh.
The original NES, if you take it and you turn it over, it's got a dial-up modem in the bottom of it. You can hook it into your phone line.
Wow.
I think, if I'm recalling correctly, that was the idea, was that you'd be able to do stocks and bonds with it. I think
that would make sense. I remember similar software for the Game Boy that they marketed toward businessmen, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were some interesting things. There were language translators and dictionary. I never played with any of that stuff. Well, I guess nobody played with it. Some people may have used it. I think there was a Bible.
I remember living near a Christian bookstore that would sell Nintendo cartridges, and they had a Bible, and they had some of the Wisdom Tree games, and I remember playing those games as a kid because I was like, oh, hey, what is this doing here? They came on like a big, strange blue cartridge.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, a question I have for you about, speaking again about the sort of, the unique hardware, when those things were coming up, and maybe this is also a broader question, but was there talk at the time, to your memory, about preservation of those things? Because there's just certain experiences in gaming, and I think about it a lot when I go to like a nice arcade where there's certain games that you could never recreate. There might be a home port, but it's not. You just can't, like you're saying with Tempest. There's certain things where it's the actual physical experience is so tied to the software in such a way that if you don't have it just right, you're losing everything, that makes it. And what was there any talk even at the time of people to go, oh, well, what do we do after the next console, after we move on from this?
No, definitely not. It was the opposite. People were in such a headlong rush to move on and move on again and move on again. With SNES, for instance, and even more so with Sega, there was sort of this view that SNES was good, but now we're N64, and even before they went to N64, if what really killed 3DO, you certainly when PlayStation and Saturn came out, they were much more powerful than 3DO. But what really killed 3DO, as far as I'm concerned, is Donkey Kong Country. Because all of a sudden, there were games on the SNES that looked as good as a 3DO game. It looked as good as Gex on the 3DO.
Yeah.
And, so all of a sudden now everyone wanted pre-rendered games. And the market really fell off, on, I know it's a hotly contested thing with the comments that I quoted Miyamoto saying, about Donkey Kong Country showing. I thought it was people, but looking back at the original magazine where I had the quote originally, I guess he said Americans is what I put. I don't have that tape anymore. Haven't had it for a long time. Speaking of not preserving things, there was a time where I had huge cases of cassettes because I'd always use a new cassette for every interview. And at some point, as I was moving towards being a novelist instead of a historian, I threw boxes of cassettes away. And then the Stanford Museum called up and said, do you have any, you wouldn't happen to have any of those old cassettes, would you? And so I went looking around and I found some, maybe 100. But on the most part, they were gone. And I regret it because there was some good stuff there and those voices. And, in that particular interview, I was in a room with Tim Stamper and Shigeru Miyamoto. And how often do you get an opportunity like that? And I don't mean just me. I mean for people who care about game history to hear Tim Stamper and Shigeru Miyamoto going back and forth.
Right. I've talked to a handful of people that have worked in the games industry that also have gone, yeah, at one point I just let this stuff go and I probably, maybe I shouldn't have, but.
Okay. So here we go. I received up to 1,500 games a year in the mail as a journalist. And for the longest time, I felt this strong need to archive them all. That didn't mean I sorted them. I threw them in boxes. And at some point, as I was going into journalism, into novel writing, I had a 3-car garage in which I could fit one car, sort of. And I was paying $50 or $60 a month for a storage unit as well. And I just decided I'm going to sell it all. And a guy said, "Oh, okay, I'll buy it. I'll give you $10,000 for the first half." And so he took off the first half, and then he gave me 20 for the second half, I think. And walked off with it. He was kind enough to say, "Hey, if you want to go through and find anything that you want to keep, you can keep it." So like there was a motorcycle game. I was in Akihabara. I was writing for MSNBC at the time, and you couldn't fill MSNBC's appetite. They just wanted stories. And so anytime I was in Japan, I'd go to Akihabara with maybe as much as $10,000 and buy bunches of weird games, and then I'd describe them and find whatever history. I didn't buy it, I regret it. There was a gold cartridge Punch-Out game. But one thing I did buy and almost kept, there was a motorcycle game for the NES. I don't remember what the name of it was, but it came with a handlebar controller. And I mean, what good is a handlebar controller if you don't have an inflatable motorcycle to sit on, right? So it had all of those things. I remember thinking, maybe I should keep that. I didn't. It never occurred to me to hold on to, never occurred to me to hold on to the still shrink-wrapped Super Mario Brothers I had.
Oh, God.
In retrospect, I would have done better to sell my house for $30,000 and and hold on to the cartridge.
Yeah. Damn.
Um, that's okay because that wasn't a gift from Nintendo. That when I had a friend who ran a used game company, and he had that on the wall. And I'd always look at that and think, that would be a fun thing to have. So one day I traded a bunch of games for it, not a super huge amount, because I don't think he was selling it for more than $20 or $30. This was
Oh
during the
my.
beginning of the N64 period, and nobody thought anything of it.
No, I remember lots of bargain bins full of NES titles by that point.
Yeah, I mean the only difference here is that it was still shrink wrap. But but then I never looked at it again. Never even when that guy offered to let me keep whatever I wanted, never even occurred to me to think about pulling that one out. Another thing, though, that really tells you about where the lack of awareness of history was. I was doing it during the NES period. I was doing a story about Punch-Out and contacted Nintendo and said, can I have a copy of Punch-Out? They didn't have one.
Hmm.
And one last story, and this is an interesting one. There was a guy who had been a PR guy for Nintendo. Then he went on to do PR for other companies. And when he retired, he called me up one day and said, "Hey, I've got all this stuff, all this memorabilia. Would you like it?" And one of the things he had was videotapes of all the news reports and things that came out on about Nintendo during the very, very early days, truly during the launch.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever Nintendo wanted a video clip, they actually had to borrow those tapes from me.
Wow.
That's how little eye people had for the future. When I went into novel writing, I gave the videos back to Nintendo. They were the rightful owners, not me.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting because I've heard anecdotes about, these landmark games having their source code thrown out. And a lot of gamers today go, well, how the hell could that have happened? But it does seem like from all accounts, there just wasn't much of an eye on preservation. I'm curious, do you know when that started to I know it's still not quite where it should be, because there's even games from, very recently that have lost their source code, and there's zero preservation on that end. But was there sort of like a noticeable shift toward, hey, maybe we should hang on to some of this stuff and or at least think about the future proofing it in some way?
Well, and it also became easier to hold on to code, right?
Right.
At a time where when I got my first computer, I got the 5 megabyte hard drive because the 10 megabyte was too expensive. That's megabyte, not gigabyte, not exabyte.
Right.
People didn't have the first time I met Shigeru Miyamoto, and I used to interview him 3-4 times a year. The first time I met him, he was really curious why somebody would come from America to interview him. He was nice. He's still nice. I haven't spoken to him in years, but he was a charming man who was just mildly curious. Why are you here? Why? What makes me interested? It was nice. It was charming. When I went out, the first time I interviewed Dave Toyer, creator of my favorite arcade game ever, Tempest. Loved, and Dave Toyer, nicest guy you ever met. I still remember we were going to go out to dinner. I was going to interview him over dinner. And I asked him where he wanted to go, and I don't remember the name of the place we went, but he suggested we go to this place that's kind of like an Applebee's. It's like, you don't want to go someplace nicer? He's like, no, this is fine. So we're interviewing as we're eating and having a nice time. And the check comes and he reaches for it. He thought he was supposed to pay for dinner. These guys, they didn't see themselves as as doing something. And then what was the Will Wright game? The one not Spawn, Spore. Oh, I can't believe it. Yeah, the Evolution game.
Spore. That sounds correct. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
We were talking once, and he told me that the compression technology used to fit all of everything on that disc for that game had been lost. He had to rediscover how to do that compression.
Wow.
There was no eye. And then all of a sudden, old arcade games started selling for lots of money.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember at one point trading 5 or 10 games for an Atari football arcade machine.
Huh. Yeah.
Now that Atari football's worth it, maybe a good used car. And the guy who I traded for it, I mean, he put in new cardboard, the stadium and everything. He had it looked like mint.
Wow.
That was a good game to own too, by the way.
I believe it. I do remember the sort of attitude where as soon as pre-rendered, especially Donkey Kong Country, I mean that made an enormous impact on me as a gamer. I mean, I wear this Rare hat all the time. That's such a important. It's just burned into me. That was one of the first times where I really felt like I was seeing something really, really new to me. You know what I mean by that? Like just.
Yeah.
It really felt like a future wave, and I do remember an overwhelming sentiment of kind of like in with the new and out with the old, and a lot of reviewers being very antagonistic toward any new 2D games after 3D became a little more ubiquitous. It was just really frowned upon by a lot of not just gamers and kids, but like industry professionals and people. I have some magazines now from mid to late 90s where they're just trashing some of these 2D games that now in retrospect some of these games are beloved titles, but there was just like a very rampant push into the future with the graphics and stuff that. It does seem that maybe goes hand in hand with the sort of, treating these things as more ephemeral than they needed to be, maybe.
One of the really wonderful moments where the critics were right, they spotted a gem, but the public just wouldn't listen, was Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
Yeah.
Which sold nothing during its release, but eventually became a bedrock game. I mean, everyone looks at it and realizes this is, if not the greatest 2D masterpiece, one of. But when it came out, people wanted 3D.
Yeah, I've read a couple contemporary pieces on that game where some people did get it, but crazy the response it got, especially now that especially in the indie space, it's like every other game's a Metroidvania. Everything is in that mold. It was such a trendsetter.
Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah.
Speaking of kind of these, different phases in gaming, do you have any impressions of the sort of FMV era? When that was, I know that's a little more of a console or PC thing. Some arcade games. What was at the time? Because I have such a fondness for those games, and as a kid, I was very young when I was seeing a lot of the earlier ones. I thought it was fascinating, but I'm curious, like, what was the perspective on those when they were coming out?
Well, I mean, at the beginning of the CD-ROM era, 93, when I started out, as a journalist covering games, the first article I ever did was covering virtual haunted houses for Halloween. That was The Seventh Guest. One of my all-time favorite games, quite frankly, Alone in the Dark, the first one. And I forget the name of third one was more of an RPG. Oh, I forget the name of it. I've got the article right there. I could go find it if I wanted to. But, and then all of a sudden came the interactive movie, the rush for interactive movies.
Mm-hmm.
When it came to those, sometimes my fangs came out. There was a company called Maccadeus. And Maccadeus wasn't any much worse than anybody else. They weren't better than most other people, but there were other companies that released a lot worse games than Maccadeus. But I must have been in a really nasty mood when I wrote my review of one of their games. And I said that they don't publish games. They purge their vaults of mildly interactive, politically correct slop. And the next day the day after the article ran, I get a call from the president of the company. And he's pretty much yelling at me, and I'm working on something else at the time anyway. So I put the phone on my shoulder and kind of let him type until he made the comment that wasn't a like he said something like that wasn't a criticism, that was a personal attack. And I picked up the phone and said, "No, man, I didn't say anything about your hair." And he hung up on me. Not my best moment.
Right.
If for some reason you're out there and you see this, it's 30 years belated, but I apologize. In the meantime, there were so many bad games put out, and much worse than Maccadeus, put out as interactive movies. That was the goal, was to be the first company with a truly interactive movie. There were some good ones. The Tex Murphy games come to mind. They had caught on in the arcades much earlier with Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, and what was the quick draw one? Mad Dog something, or
Yeah. I want to say McGraw, but I have played it.
Yeah, and they made a 3DO version, so we've gone the loop. But those were, on the most part, especially Dragon's Lair, was more of a multiple choice quiz than it was a game.
It was kind of a trial and error thing too, because I don't remember. I mean, it's been a long time since I played it, but I feel like you can get a perfect game if you know the move, right? There's not much variation.
Well, so back in Hawaii, where I grew up, there was a guy who could beat Dragon's Lair blindfolded.
Well, I think that says it all.
Now, in my case, I couldn't beat Dragon's Lair unblindfolded. I mean,
I've died on those opening screens more times than I can count, probably.
Yeah. The to this day I rave about it. The high point for Game Boy, when Game Boy Color had come out, was Digital Eclipse released a Dragon's Lair cartridge. And this Dragon's Lair cartridge had the entire arcade game. The sound wasn't very good, but it was the only place you could go where you got all the levels in the correct order. And it looked great, and it played exactly like the arcade machine. I think that was, technologically speaking, maybe not artistically speaking, but technologically speaking, that was the all-time high point for Game Boy. It was really a brilliant piece of work.
Yeah, I remember playing that. Yeah, there is a handful of things that I've even seen some prototypes from that era where the hardware really could be pushed in some surprising ways.
Well, I remember speaking with the late Joel Hochberg about, because when you looked at Donkey Kong Country for Game Boy, it looked great. And I remember pointing out, there's still this huge base of NESs out there. And he said, yeah, we could probably, it wouldn't be the same, but we could probably pull off a Donkey Kong Country on the NES. But those NESs that are out there aren't in use.
That reminds me of something that I'm curious if you can speak on this at all. I think in parts of, I want to say Brazil, the NES had a much, much longer life.
Actually, in Brazil, it wasn't the NES, it was the Sega Master System.
Okay.
The Sega Master System, for all I know, it's still going. If you look at the fall of Sega, where Sega really destroyed itself, they abandoned Genesis too early. But at that point, they had Genesis, they had Genesis CD, they had 32X.
Yep.
And all of these are different operating systems. They had Pico.
Yes.
In Brazil, the Master System was still going strong. They had Saturn out. And I'm missing. Oh, they had Game Gear. That was its own system. None of these had the same operating system, and they're trying to float them all simultaneously.
Yeah. I remember being a bit confused by it at the time, even as a gamer, not understanding. Especially, I was very confused by the difference between like the Genesis and the 32X and all the add-ons. It didn't totally compute for me at the time.
I still remember Tom Kalinske trying to convince me that if you had a 32X and a Genesis and a Sega CD, you really had a Saturn. This was before Saturn came out.
Right.
And I mentioned that to Trip Hawkins over at 3DO, and he said, that's ludicrous. That's absolutely ludicrous. There's no sense to that. Why would you parse out your new console?
Right.
And he was right. I did an article way back then where it was called The World According to Trip.
Mm-hmm.
And I let him spout off. And I still remember him saying that, if Nintendo says that the N64 is going to come out next year, well, you wait till this time next year and they'll say it's coming out next year. And he said the stuff about the Saturn, about the 32X and the Sega CD and the Genesis making a Saturn, said absolutely not true. He said that the Atari Jaguar, you can do whatever math you want. That's not a 64-bit processor. And I because in real journalism, what you do is you give people a chance to refute. So I called each of the companies and they each defended themselves and said he was dead wrong. And history now proves that he was exactly right on every single one of them.
Just to rewind a little bit, have you seen some of the unofficial ports of like a Donkey Kong Land or Donkey Kong Country to the NES?
No. How do they look?
They look pretty much like a colorized version of the Game Boy port. They look pretty good.
That's what Joel said they could do.
There I've seen some stuff. Now that I think about it, there was some Master System stuff, but there is sort of like a gray market in some of those areas where even up until probably not so much right now, but not that long ago, games still being manufactured, and new games being manufactured for those 8-bit systems.
With homebrew, it's still going on.
And they're doing some really wild stuff. Is that, I've heard people suggest that maybe Sega or Nintendo were unofficially supporting those systems in those markets. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, I can't see Nintendo ever supporting anything like that. Sega maybe, but one story I will tell you was I can't believe I'm forgetting his name because he's one of the people I really love. I mean, really nice guy. Just Ed Freeze. Oh, I can't believe I had trouble. That's embarrassing. I'm sorry. Ed Freeze. Have you ever met Ed Freeze? No. One of the great gentlemen of games. and somebody who really, really, really loves games. You know who he is, though,
I
right?
know the name, yes.
Okay, so Ed was at the developers conference, and um, he ran into Mike Micah and Chris Charla they were at Digital Eclipse at the time. And I think it was them. I think he said to them, I'm waiting for somebody to come out with an Atari 2600 version of Halo. And they said, do it. So he did it.
Yeah,
That was how that came about.
that's funny. I
It,
didn't know the
it may have
backstory
been the
there.
other way around, that they said they could do it and he told them to. But that it was with those three people. Ed Freeze. So, for instance, he got himself a color version of Gotcha, and the first Maze Chase game, an Atari. And I didn't even know there was a color. I played the black and white of it, but he found a color and he's doing everything he can to rebuild it, to preserve it. There's somebody who recognizes that this was the birth of a new medium, and really truly is putting his money and his time and his efforts into preserving it. The purest gamer, maybe one of the purest gamers I've ever known.
I have noticed that at Atari, especially the Atari, the collection they put out recently, the Atari 50. Have you seen that?
I've seen previews of it, and I think Digital Eclipse which was just purchased by Atari. I think they were the ones who actually made it.
Yeah,
and that's a good group of. Again, I think Mike Micah's involved with that.
they also did the now I can't think what the title's called. It's the prior to Prince of Persia. The I can't remember the name of the game now.
The fighting game? Karateka.
Yes. Have you seen the sort of interactive documentary they've put together? It's one of the it's one of the greatest. It just came out very recently, but it's you sort of play through the history and making of the game, and it has all this. It's one of the most in-depth sort of like. It's like an exhibition, almost. It's hard to describe it. It's not like anything else I've really seen.
Have you ever interviewed or have you met Mike Micah?
No, I know I'm familiar with his work, but
one, of course, a brilliant game designer, but two, I mean, Mike Micah at any point could leave all this reproduction stuff he's doing and make a fortune elsewhere. But he genuinely loves what he's doing. And I'm sure he's doing fine. I have no doubt about that. But he's incredibly talented, but he loves old games and the preservation again. I think that's where you find more of the purer guys.
I have one more question here about kind of. Let's think how I want to say this. This is kind of like a very subjective kind of thing, but I was kind of fielding some questions from some of the people that follow the channel. And a couple people asked, basically, one take on this question, which was like, do you think that in terms of mainstream games, do you think that there is a decline in creativity? Which it seems like that's kind of like a harsh thing to suggest, but Are you seeing as much of a, and have you seen as much of a pioneering attitude in game creation and gaming in general, as much as there may have been, in previous decades?
There are companies I will look to for creativity and leadership. Insomniac, Ted Price. I will look to him because I think he constantly is looking for ways to expand things. I think Naughty Dog does a good job of that generally, although maybe not as much as they did in the past. I think Nintendo as a company, despite the fact that, let's face it, they live on Mario, Zelda, and Mario Kart, and Pokemon.
Yeah.
But, those were incredibly innovative games when they came out. Nintendo takes chances and does a nice job. Sony, you know what? Sony gets a bum rap because I got to tell you, Sony will throw money down a rabbit hole to try and establish art. Parappa the Rapper, Ico, even God of War. I couldn't review God of War as much as I respected God of War because there were things I couldn't make myself do. There's that scene early on where you have your comrades that are trapped in cages and you drag their cages and they think you're saving them, but you drop them into the fire pit. I couldn't get myself to do it. I just couldn't get myself to do it. I think that Take-Two is a company that will take chances. A lot of chances. Obviously Grand Theft Auto is always on the cutting edge. On the other hand, I think companies like Activision are running away from taking chances now. I think EA is not for a company, EA in the late 80s, early 90s, especially the 90s, was the company that paved the way. It was the company that was established to treat artists, game creators, as true artists and like rock stars. And boy, have they walked away from that. They seem more like Atari, like old Atari, than they do like old EA.
Yeah.
But you see the same thing in movies. When's the last time you saw a truly new movie?
Yeah.
Have you seen the new Godzilla?
Not yet, no.
For me, it's by far the best Godzilla yet. It's a really wonderful movie.
I've heard some very positive reviews.
It's subtitles, thank you very much. And the thing that makes it especially good is it's a great redemption movie, and Godzilla happens to be in it. Wonderful movie. Wonderful movie. You don't see that anymore, not very much. And in games, it's hard to do. Godzilla just turned 70. So making a Godzilla movie that returned to its roots was okay. But for a game, if you make a Call of Duty that returns to its 15-year-old roots, that's not saying as much.
Right. Yeah, it's also probably not as marketable.
Yeah, it isn't. And we're getting worse in some ways. I mean, first of all, the companies that belch out the most games are the EAs and the Activisions. And they're not chance takers. They're not risk takers. So that hurts. They're not big risk takers. Activision has been a risk taker at times. I mean, I talk in my book about how, when they came out with their first Spider-Man for the Dreamcast and the PlayStation, and you really had to web sling. You had to, it was amazing. And then they rehashed that exact Spider-Man 10 times in a row.
Yeah.
And Rockstar came out and you thought, wow, this is the epitome. It was so creative, even though it was a little derivative of other games. Certainly it borrowed from from Parappa the Rapper and a bunch of Japanese games. But still, I mean, who had thought of that? And then to put real rock on it. And when Tony Hawk came out.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, kind of what have you done for me lately? And then like, have you ever heard of Majestic? I think it was called Majestic. It was an EA game.
Mm-hmm.
Neil Young worked on it. Not Neil Young, the musician. Neil Young, the game designer.
Mm-hmm.
Such a creative game. I would never want to play it in a million billion years, but such an innovative game. I mean, so here was this game where it had a very extended period of you putting your personal information in so before you could play it. You gave it your phone number. It asked if you had a fax number. It wanted your email, and you had to put all that in to play. And then it gives you sort of an X-Files type mystery. But it starts calling you and leaving phone messages and things that are threatening you. It was really brilliant. It was really, really, truly innovative. And it sold like nothing. You know, and so companies like EA and Activision, they're like fighters who've been tagged a few times and they cover up and they're not throwing, you know, the wild, hard punches anymore because they just want to get through the round. But both companies have periods where they were wildly creative.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose there has to be an ebb and flow of those things, but it is nice that, you know, you can point to places that you can look to for certain quality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same with, you know, movies, which have been around for, 150 years? But it's also the same with books.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at this point, if you propose a book, your publisher wants to know, can you make it a series?
Mm-hmm.
Because one-off books or a series of books, you know, one-offs, you sell one, that's great. Maybe your next book isn't hot. Maybe you never do another book. You know, remember Memoirs of a Geisha?
Mm-hmm.
Phenomenal book. They practically issued it to people.
Mm-hmm.
He never did a sequel. He never did another book. Arthur Golden never did another book. You know, you do sequels or series, and each one of those makes money for the company. That's a much better investment.
Were there any games that you experienced that did not make it to the US that you kind of wish had come over here, or you thought maybe could have had a chance over here that you know?
There were some that I wish hadn't come over too. I don't remember the name of the game, but there's this one game that I saw in Japan. It was an original PlayStation, and it was just so weird and wacky. And it was about this guy having this really horrible, horrible day. So he's got a crush on this one girl he's married to someone else, but he goes to work and he has a crush on this woman that he's at work with. And then the whole office is doing their stretching exercises together. And there's an Atlas statue, I think, outside the window. And the Atlas shrugs or something, and its giant globe falls into their building. And he goes running down the stairs, and just as he gets to the base of the stairs, there's the ball again, and it chases him down the street. And this happens and that happens. And I think he gets crushed by the ball, but so he's now in an ambulance, and the people in the ambulance are asking him questions, and the more he doesn't answer the questions correctly, the more bad things they do to him. And then his stretcher rolls out of the ambulance, and somehow he survives all that and goes to a Ferris wheel, and he gets on the Ferris wheel with that girl he's had a crush on all along. You know, and you're thinking in the back of your mind, well, wait a second, aren't you married, pal?
Right.
And the game was hilarious. You know, and playing it in Japanese was really tough because, you know, I don't I don't speak much more Japanese than the two phrases you really need most, which are mizu kudasai and doku desu ka toilet. And if you know how to ask for water, you really need to know how to ask for toilets as well.
Fair enough.
So, like when they're asking them questions, I just had to guess, okay, this one, so it took a million tries to get through that. And finally I get them on the Ferris wheel, and it makes no sense what's going on there. Once in a while I'll get a little something, so I finally gave up. Then it comes out in English, and I'm a fairly straight up guy. I'm pretty Christian. He's trying to cause her to have an orgasm on the Ferris wheel. You're not seeing him. You hear them talking from the outside.
Right.
And I liked that game a whole lot more before it came out into America. Then there was the company that brought that. I don't remember the name of the company, but they were a company that really took risks. They also brought Mr. Mosquito to America.
Okay, I'm familiar with that. That's another odd one.
Yeah, that's what they did, was they found odd games and brought them here. And again, to me, that shows companies that are willing to take risks, that really love the industry. They're not out to make $1 million. And you got to kind of cheer for those guys. What was the name? It was like sort of a puzzle fireworks game that came out with the PlayStation, Fantavision, I think.
I'm not familiar.
It was with the PlayStation 2. It was one of the launch titles. It was so gorgeous to look at. And, I played that and thought, this is really pretty cool. It's kind of limited, but I think I could see it doing okay in America. And it didn't. Once in a while, you'd see Vic Ireland, with Working Designs. I think he was Working Designs.
I believe so, yeah. They did a lot of the localization.
Yeah, he was... You know what his shtick was? It was wonderful.
Yeah.
He loved RPGs. Japanese RPGs. Which he knew didn't sell well here in America at the time. So he would bring in Japanese shooters, which he knew would make enough money for him to then gamble on a new RPG with.
I didn't realize that aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. I liked Vic. Japan, especially, I think, in the 90s, there was so much fun and weird and wacky going on there that we didn't do here. So much of what we did here was stayed and remains so. But, I also remember, especially around the time Grand Theft Auto came out, talking with Hideo Kojima. And Kojima talking about how playing American games had been like going to a restaurant where the restaurant is beautiful and the food is good, but maybe the service wasn't so good. And then with Grand Theft Auto and a couple of other games, he said, that's really changed. Now they're just as good.
That was something I was kind of curious about was, any impressions on that sort of shift toward taking Western developers a little more seriously? Because it seemed like it, for the longest time, I mean, rare, that there's a few, but really it was a minority for a long, long time, it seemed.
Yeah, Rare, Naughty Dog, EA managed to do some damage because it set up that relationship with Squaresoft. By the way, I remember something I wanted to say. When you were asking about attempts to stop digital downloading, you know what really set people off, especially in Japan more than the United States, was reselling of games. In Japan, first of all, the Japanese game market towards the early 2000s dropped 30% in a single year. A large part of that drop was when Docomo started, they came out with, kids started texting each other, and you paid a little bit for each text, and little girls were having so much fun texting each other that they didn't have money to buy games anymore. And other things were happening too. The console business still has not returned to Japan fully. Um, you know, so, but the other thing was, the Japanese game companies really felt that, hey, you're reselling us. You're making a lot of money reselling what we did. Where's our share of it?
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that with used cars. I sell a used car. I don't have to give Hyundai. I always drive Hyundais. I don't have to give Hyundai a percentage when I sell my used car.
Right.
Um, the music industry, one of the strengths with digital download is you can't resell your records anymore because you're buying them digitally. You can't distribute those. Well, you can copy them, but that's not legal. Games tried very hard to fight against it, but Akihabara, back when Akihabara was where you went to buy games, you saw more and more used games all over the place. So when did one of the reasons, but that leads to one of the reasons that Western development started being taken more serious was back in the 90s, Japan was by far the most lucrative market. And the reason why was, even though you didn't sell as much hardware in Japan, you sold more software. And the name of the game is to sell software, not hardware. You actually lose a little money usually on this hardware. Whereas the United States, people are more likely to own 2 or 3 consoles, but they may only buy 3 or 4 games a year. Back in the day in Japan, they were buying 6 or 7 games a year. So that made that, very lucrative. Part of the problem that Microsoft always faced was, that first Xbox only sold a few 100,000 units in Japan. The 360, that sold. That was the only one that ever hit 1 million in Japan. And one of the reasons, to me, it seems like, and Microsoft could tell me I'm dead wrong, and they'd know better than I would. Of course, that doesn't mean they're being honest, because honesty and marketing seldom go perfectly together. But one of the reasons, to me, it seems like Microsoft might be looking at new consoles is, for me, for my personal taste, the Xbox Series X is probably the best console ever made. I mean, it's as powerful as the PlayStation. It doesn't have as good a controller as the PlayStation. I think the PlayStation has the most innovative controller I've ever seen.
I agree.
Well, that's not true. I mean, there was the glove and stuff, the power glove, but
the haptic feedback and everything,
and the trigger.
Yeah. The adaptive trigger. Yeah, they're very, very intense.
Yeah, it's a brilliant controller. With the power glove. Have you ever driven a Toyota Yaris?
No.
Okay, well, the Yaris, when it first came out, it was the first car to do this, I'm sure. Didn't have the speedometer in front of you in the wheel. It had it where the radio was supposed to be. And very distracting to drive and want to make sure you're at speed limit and have to go like that. So I always sort of envisioned the meeting when they created the Yaris, where the CEO of Toyota comes in and says, with this car, I want to do something that's never been done before. And his chief of engineering says, hey, does it have to be a good idea? And the CEO says, well, not necessarily. So he says, well, we can put the odometer here. And that's how you got the Yaris. And, I kind of feel that's how you got some of the controllers for the NES as well. But that's not how I feel about the controller for the PlayStation. PlayStation 5 is a brilliant controller.
Yeah.
But even taking that controller, the Xbox Series X, which is backwards compatible to every Xbox game that wasn't for Kinect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really something, and improves the look of those games so that they'll play on a high res TV. Because like for me, the high point of Xbox games, and this is going to show how old I am. Not that my hair doesn't do a really good job of doing that, anyways. The high point of Xbox gaming for me was Burnout 3 Takedown.
Okay.
I just freaking love that game. I love everything about that game. I love sitting down and playing that game with a friend and chasing each other to cause accidents. I love the levels where you just try to make an accident. I like the music for it. I like the cars for it. I just love that. That's the high point, at least of racing games for me. You can have your GTA, your Gran Turismos, and your Forza Motorsports. I once did a review of Microsoft Flight Simulator,
Mm-hmm.
in which I suggested that next year they could come out with a game called Microsoft Drive Home Simulator, and you could buy an expansion pack that had accurate depictions of all the mailboxes you passed on your way home. And lo and behold, in a lot of ways, that's what Sony did with Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsport. You're driving on real roads and real cars. Well, I live in Seattle. I used to drive down I-90 and I-5 all the time in my little red Toyota Corolla. So why do I want to do it on my PlayStation? Yes, you can break the law, but I got news for you. Gran Turismo was so accurate, you couldn't, in your Toyota Corolla, you couldn't break the law all that badly. Because the laws of reality only let your car go so far.
Right.
Whereas Burnout, you got to get killed in an accident and then like Wile E. Coyote, you dusted yourself off, looked a little chagrined for a moment, and got back in your car and started driving again.
Yeah, I've never identified with the more simulation type games, personally. But I know someone who, upgraded their PC specifically for the last flight simulator, and
absolutely,
there are fanatics out there, but I do prefer something a little more fantastical, maybe.
Well, and Gran Turismo isn't a game or a simulation; it's a religion for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And if you ever meet the guy who did it, at least back when I met him, who I think he owned the company too. He was driving around Tokyo in a rally car. That was what he drove. He was doing what he loved and bringing it full scale, absolutely accurately to your PlayStation. More power to him. There are people who write. Stephanie Meyer wrote the Twilight books, and I sat down and was amazed how impressive that book was. Just thought, wow, this is really wonderful writing, right up to the point where I thought if I read another page of it, I'd have to shoot myself. But what she did was she identified an audience and gave that audience exactly what they wanted. And that's what Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsport and Microsoft Flight Simulator, that's what they specialize in.
On a completely different note, I'm kind of just researching another project on the side here. I want to ask you, did you ever see the Bishibashi games in Japan?
What are those?
Are you familiar with like the WarioWare games?
Yeah, loved them.
Very similar to WarioWare, but came out in, I want to say 96, 97 maybe they started. And it's the same idea as WarioWare, just like the 5-10 second micro games. It was an arcade title. You had 3 big buttons, like a red, blue, and green button. There's probably 12 or 15 of them that have come out since the mid 90s, and they've never hit the United States.
Where's the hit? Well, I guess there's Dave and Buster's.
Right, but I mean, never even in the '90s they never hit. They never came over. There was a PlayStation port that came out in the UK, so there was a localized version of it, but that's the only one. I'm doing some research on this series and just trying to see if people I talk to are familiar with it at all, because I love the WarioWare series and I thought that's so novel. Where have I seen anything else like this? And I really hadn't seen anything prior. And then doing a little more digging, I think the main reason why I couldn't find anything was because this, it's a Japanese exclusive arcade series. And they did a bunch of them. They did one with like like the heavy barrel, like the rotating joysticks. They did one with a driving wheel. One with like a step pad, but the main series is just those three big buttons, and you're just blazing through a bunch of different micro games like that. And
WarioWare certainly was, especially the first one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, remember, if you played well enough on all the little short games, you got one of the big games you got was that paper airplane down a twisted corridor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just everything they did. And I still remember I called their PR firm when that came out and said, I've got the best press release for you. They're like, what's that? Historic day for Nintendo, releases 65 new games in a single day. And she liked it, the PR person, contacted Nintendo. And 3 months later, they approved it. And of course, by then, they'd moved on to the next thing. So there's no way in the world they'd ever use it.
Right.
By that time they were probably working on Topekachu, Kansas. But I was so proud of that little. Yeah. Anyways, loved WarioWare.
I was just curious if you'd heard that other series, because I'm kind of going into I'm writing a piece about the history of games in that style of WarioWare that came in the years prior.
Are there very many besides this series you're talking about?
Well, WarioWare itself, 5 or 6 of the games were first appeared in a disk drive, the N64 DD system. It was the sequel to Mario Paint. They changed the title. It was like Mario Studio or something. I can't remember what the exact title is. But there was like in Mario Paint, there was the mini games in there, and you go into the sub menus, you could find a little fly swatter game and things.
Yeah.
This similar was an art tool, but in the sub menus, there was a little mini game, and it was 5 or 6 of the WarioWare games. And just like 1-to-1 recreations. And then, a few years later, that same studio developed that idea out into WarioWare. So that's one thing I was really surprised to find, was there was basically just a prototype, those Japanese exclusive. And then I do think that in a similar way, the Point Blank series.
Loved Point Blank.
I think is not exactly the same, but the same idea where here, very quirky humor. And also just, here's your objective. Go ahead and do it real fast,
Yeah.
But yeah, no, Bishibashi, that's the main one. I've also found a lot of independent games that have come out since then that I think scratch a similar itch, but I'm not finding as many as I thought I would. But I'm shocked to find there are, a dozen or more of the Bishibashi arcade titles that I'm having a hard time finding much information on them, because they just put out a new one not that long ago. But they're not coming out. They've never left Japan. I've never even seen any imported cabinets anywhere. I've been calling up different arcades and nobody has them.
Have you ever tried the Galloping Ghost over in Chicago?
Nothing there.
Yeah, if the Galloping Ghost doesn't have it, you're kind of out of luck.
Right. That was my impression. But yeah, I was just curious. That's another little side project of mine. I'm just trying to look at the history of that.
You want a Point Blank anecdote?
Yeah, please.
Just kind of an interesting thing. Remember, that came out during the school shooting period.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody at Namco came up with the not so brilliant idea when America was scared of school shooting, having an advertisement saying that more fun than shooting your neighbor's cat. And Bill Clinton himself spoke out against it.
Wow.
It was very clear that Clinton, who was president at the time, had no idea what the game was. But he had, attacked the game as being very violent. Of course, you're actually saving people, not shooting people. And when you shoot people, they're made of cardboard.
Yeah, and it's one of the most. It's such a tongue-in-cheek game, anyway.
Yeah. But I met with Masaya Nakamura the day after Clinton spoke out. And Nakamura was that rattled him. That bothered him deeply. Nakamura-san was an interesting man. I only got to interview him 2 or 3 times, but he was an interesting man.
That's so neat. Well, that's everything I got for you tonight.
I hope I was worth your time.
This has been a great chat. I really appreciate it.
It was good meeting you, Matt.
I'll be in touch by my follow-ups, but I'm gonna edit this together and get it out there before too long.
Send me a link.
All right. Thank you so much for taking your time to speak with me.
Been a pleasure being here. Have a good night.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.